Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAspergersChat.com, and today I wanted to talk about the disparity between the female neurotypical brain and the autistic male brain. So if you are a neurotypical partner in a relationship with a man on the autism spectrum and you find yourselves in frequent disagreements and fights and misunderstandings, it shouldn't be too terribly surprising because the two of you are wired almost 180-degree opposite. We'll look at 5 points to illustrate this. Point number 1, neurotypical women tend to be more talkative and utilize nonverbal cues very quickly and easily, whereas men on the autism spectrum tend to be less talkative and they don't pick up on nonverbal cues. Point number 2, neurotypical women tend to want to work through relationship problems, whereas men on the autism spectrum tend to want to avoid discussing relationship problems when possible because it raises their anxiety such that they have a hard time listening and understanding and retaining and following through. Instead, they may do some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. Issue number 3, neurotypical women tend to intuit emotions and emotional cues very quickly and easily, whereas men on the autism spectrum tend to be alexithymic. In other words, they have great difficulty understanding emotions in themselves and others. Point number 4, neurotypical women tend to focus on how to create a solution that works for the couple, whereas men on the autism spectrum tend to be more isolated and independent and would rather find a solution on their own. And point number 5, neurotypical women tend to approach times of stress by forming strong group bonds, especially with their significant other, in this case, their autistic husband. Whereas men on the autism spectrum tend to have a fight or flight response to stressful situations, and they deal with stress either through avoidance or an expression of anger. So, given these differences, it's easy to understand why neurodiverse relationships take so many odd twists and turns. So, neurodiverse partners would do well to extend just a bit of grace and mercy to one another, knowing that each is wired so differently that conflict and misunderstanding is inevitable. She wants emotional reciprocity, she being the NT wife, neurotypical. But in pretty much all cases, and I work with men only, women only, groups of couples only. I have all the demographics covered, all the bases covered. And in almost all cases, the NT wife's approach to try to get you to be emotionally reciprocal ends up raising your anxiety such that you want to just disconnect from her, purely for anxiety reduction purposes, which yields the opposite result of what she's trying to do. And I'm not trying to blame her I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I will go on record as saying that her method of getting you to be a team player and getting you to connect and be more empathic and affectionate, her method of going about that has in too many cases driven you away, which makes, not to blame her, I mean, you have your share, you're contributing to the issues as well, but when you pull away, and in many cases, I got to tell you guys, in many cases, she has become his number one source of anxiety. She's come that far up in status as she is now my number one source of anxiety. I mean, I'm not saying that connecting with her is not important to you. It's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying her need for the connection is more important to her than it is you. And if she were here, she would say, you don't provide enough emotional reciprocity, that you don't listen. I'm just going to make some things up that you've probably heard. You don't listen, you don't empathize, you don't validate me, and so on and so on. You've probably heard it all many times before. And so if this has gone on for years and years and years, you may have experienced this too. She is super resentful and angry, and maybe even at some level revengeful. And so what has happened, and I'm not blaming you guys, you're wired the way that you're wired. There's nothing wrong with you. It is what it is. But by virtue of your supposed lack of empathy and her heightened resentment, we're going to call that a cancer in the relationship. So you guys, most of you are experiencing a relationship cancer right now, and you're in the middle. You've just begun treatment last week. Last Wednesday, you just began treatment. And so the whole point of this conversation is that you can, as much as I almost hate to say it, because it sounds kind of disconcerting at some level, you guys are in for the long haul. You have to be in for the long haul. This is not something we're going to resolve in a few weeks of meeting here. You're going to have to apply the assignments that we talk about. You're going to have to be consistent with it. And she is going to have to see some significant change. So there's actually going to be three things. It's going to have to be significant change. In other words, something that really stands out in her attention. It's going to have to be consistent change. In other words, change that remains consistent over time. And with those two things, a fairly radical change that she views consistent over time, then and only then will she begin to reduce her resentment level. Right now, it's most likely that many of you guys are experiencing a thing where her heart is cold as ice. And she probably has lost trust. She's probably given up hope in some cases. And she's also probably reluctant to give you the benefit of the doubt so early, even if she does witness some significant change, because if she were here, she would say, well, I know there's been times before when he's changed, supposedly changed, but it never lasted very long. And it was just a matter of time before he went back to his old ways. So even if she saw some consistent change in you, a significant change in your empathy level, we'll say, she still wouldn't be necessarily willing to acknowledge it, because she would be concerned that if I start having hope again and he lets me down again, I'm not sure I can handle it. So she may even be withholding affection or acknowledgement or praise or pointing out that you're actually doing something right for fear of being let down again. So everybody in here is in for a long haul deal. You have to be willing to tough this out and realize that this fix, for the lack of a better term, is not going to happen anytime soon. That's not to say you wouldn't see some improvement if you're doing the assignments. You should be able to see some improvement in her response to you, but it's not going to be anything real super observable or noticeable for quite a while, because again, she's going to have to see significant change, and she's going to have to see that spread out over the course of the next several months before she's going to have a change in attitude. And that change of attitude in her mind would be, you know what, he is making some significant changes, and he has been consistently doing so over the last 3 or 4 months. Maybe he really has turned the corner. Fighting multiple battles is making you physically and mentally sick. I run into all the time, really, neurodiverse couples who fight every battle that comes down the pike. Neurodiverse couples are notorious for just piling a bunch of disputes on the table without categorizing, prioritizing. They won't talk about how sex isn't good, the money problems, kid problems, quality time or lack thereof, chores are not getting done, or somebody feels like they're doing all the chores, and pet peeves, dirty dishes, the in-laws, and the list just goes on. And they're both just chasing their tails, quite honestly. And the problem with that is, if you are not judicious about which battles to fight and you just fight everything, then you become toxic to one another. And you get the two of you in the same room, and it almost always ends up in some kind of a debate or argument or fight, etc. The problem with this is people who fight every battle that comes down the pike also are in a lot of emotional pain. Chronic, low-grade emotional pain is what I call it. And those who are in chronic, low-grade emotional pain tend to perceive slights and disrespect where there is none. And if they are always on the alert for any sign of disrespect or lack of cooperation or a personal insult or being controlled by the other person, etc., they're going to be much more willing to continue to fight every battle that comes down the pike. So over time, they're fighting more and more battles, thus increasing the emotional pain, and you're in this cycle. So obviously, you would want to do the opposite of that. And my suggestion would be to pick the top 3 issues that you want to resolve. I'm not saying don't fight any battles, and I am saying you want to do fair fighting, but you don't want to fight every battle that comes down the pike. And so I would say pick 3. Just for starters, pick 3, but don't fight all 3 at one time. So brainstorm about the most important issues. Keep it to 3 just for now. Try to have some dialogue on one of those 3. And then when you get some resolve on one of those, then you can move on to the second one. Then you can move on to the third one. All others are not fair game for one damn comment. Let me repeat that. Anything outside of those top 3 is not fair game for debate, argument, discussion, etc. Pick your battles carefully. And if you choose to fight every battle that comes down the pike, you are choosing mental illness and physical illness. And if you're getting sick by fighting too many battles at once, hasn't manifested in mental health issues or physical health issues yet, give it a few years, and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. A meltdown can be viewed as consisting of 3 phases. There's the escalation of anxiety, the explosion of pent-up anxiety, and post-explosion. Together, they make up the meltdown cycle. In this process, the escalation phase is characterized by cues that indicate anxiety is building. Now, these cues can be physical, behavioral, emotional, or cognitive, and they are warning signs or responses to anxiety-provoking events. Events, on the other hand, are situations that occur every day that may lead to escalations of anxiety if effective anxiety control methods are not used. Red flag events are types of situations that are unique to you and that you are especially sensitive to because of past events. And these events can involve internal processes, for example, thinking about situations that were anxiety-provoking in the past, or external processes, for example, experiencing real-life anxiety-provoking situations in the here and now. If the escalation phase is allowed to continue, the explosion phase will follow. Now, the explosion phase is marked by an uncontrollable discharge of anxiety displayed as verbal or physical aggression. Now, this discharge in turn leads to negative consequences, and it's synonymous with the number 10 on an emotional dysregulation meter. You could think of this meter as similar to a thermometer. The final stage of the meltdown cycle is the post-explosion phase, and it's characterized by negative consequences that resulted from the verbal or physical aggression that was displayed during the explosion phase. These consequences could include feelings of guilt, shame, regret, a post-meltdown shutdown. In other words, he explodes and then later on he goes and hibernates and isolates and tries to stay away from people. Separation or divorce, family members and friends that no longer want to be around you, being terminated from a job, and in some cases even going to jail. Now, the intensity, frequency, and duration of anxiety in a meltdown cycle varies among individuals. For example, one person's anxiety may escalate rapidly after a provocative event and within just a few minutes reach the explosion phase. Another's anxiety may escalate slowly but steadily over several hours before reaching the explosion phase. So it will be important to understand your pattern here. In other words, do you go from 1 to 100 miles an hour quickly, or do you creep up from 1 mile an hour to 100 miles an hour over the course of several minutes or even up to an hour? Also, one may experience more episodes of anxiety and progress through the meltdown cycle more often than the other. However, both people, despite differences in how quickly their anxiety escalates and how frequently they experience anxiety, will undergo all 3 phases of the meltdown cycle. The intensity of anxiety from one person to the next also will be different. One person may engage in more violent behavior than the other in the explosion phase. For example, he might assault someone. The other person may express his anxiety during the explosion phase by shouting at or threatening another person. But regardless of these individual differences, the explosion phase is synonymous with losing control and becoming verbally or physically aggressive, and we call this emotional dysregulation. Another term that is used but doesn't quite capture the severity of this situation is low frustration tolerance. Now, notice that the escalation and explosion phases of the meltdown cycle correspond to the levels on the emotional dysregulation meter. The points below 10 on the meter represent the escalation phase, or the building up of anxiety. The explosion phase, on the other hand, corresponds to 10 on this meter. And it is kind of an imaginary meter at this point. So again, 10 on the meter is the point at which one loses control and expresses anxiety through verbal or physical aggression that leads to negative consequences. One of the primary objectives of anxiety control treatment is to keep from reaching the explosion phase. And this is accomplished by using the emotional dysregulation meter to monitor changes in your anxiety, attending to the cues or warning signs that indicate anxiety is building, and employing the appropriate methods from your anxiety control plan to stop escalation. If the explosion phase is prevented from occurring, the post-explosion phase will not occur and the meltdown cycle will be broken. So if you use your anxiety control plan effectively, your anxiety should ideally reach between a 1 and a 9 on the emotional dysregulation meter. By preventing the explosion phase, which is a 10, you will not experience the same level of negative consequences of the post-explosion phase, and you will then be able to break the destructive cycle. So the general philosophy of people on the autism spectrum, and this is very generalized by the way, is based in the belief system that people are largely just in the way of me completing tasks. People are mostly an impediment to me engaging in my special interest. People are mostly obstacles to me engaging in my self-soothing anxiety reduction activities. So based on that belief system, the inner dialogue or self-talk is usually along the lines of, I must be able to engage in my special interest as often as possible for anxiety reduction reasons. I need to be distracted with something pleasurable to escape the anxieties experienced in the real world. And I need to engage in activities that alleviate boredom because most things outside of my special interest are painfully boring. So based on that self-talk, the emotion that's evoked is often one of frustration. In fact, it is exceedingly common, in fact, we will say 100% of the time, for people on the autism spectrum to have low frustration tolerance. Feelings of frustration are largely due to people getting in the way of completing tasks, disrupting their routine and structure, and imposing change on them, unwanted change. When this happens, the feelings of frustration can then graduate to anger or anxiety overload, the first of which may manifest in the form of a meltdown or tantrum, the second of which may result in a shutdown. So based on that particular belief system and the associated self-talk and the associated feelings of frustration and anger, behaviorally, the individual will appear rigid, self-absorbed, disconnected from relationships, and preoccupied with things. In other words, tasks, objects, facts, figures, and so on. Today I have a message for the NT spouses. And of course, we know that NTs can be male or female. We know ASD individuals can be male or female. I'm going to use the example where she is the NT and he is the guy on the autism spectrum. And so she will often say, we still have problems. He's not improving. Nothing gets better. We're still having communication breakdown and so on. And then on closer inspection, I realize that she is continuing to treat him like a neurotypical. She continues to insist on approaching him as if he was normal. He is not normal. Stop it, okay? He's not normal. And the more you assume that he is going to respond to your neurotypical ways, the more frustrated you're going to be. You wouldn't treat a snapping turtle like a toy poodle, right? You wouldn't give a snapping turtle a bone. You wouldn't play catch with it. You wouldn't have it sit on your lap and pet it. You wouldn't take it to the groomers. You wouldn't take it for a walk around the park and so on. And the longer you treated the snapping turtle like a toy poodle, the more frustrated this turtle is going to get to the point where he may snap and now you're missing the tip of your thumb and you wonder what you did wrong. Here's a rhetorical question for you. Let's pretend that you met up with somebody from a different planet. And this person had a blind spot, a huge blind spot, with respect to how you think, how you feel, and why you behave the way you do. How would you try to communicate with that entity? How would you respond? How would you try to help? So in this example, let's say that you realize that this person from a different planet had this huge blind spot but then you took it on yourself to try to improve him, as if he shouldn't be wired that way. And in this scenario, imagine that the harder you tried to fix a deficit that you perceived to be a deficit, the bigger his blind spots became. And then it got to the point where this entity gets so frustrated that now he gives up trying to communicate with you at all. Because, ladies, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with somebody who has a huge blind spot with respect to what and why you think the way you do, what and why you feel the way you do, what and why you behave the way you do. And so when you take offense of that, and I'm not blaming you, it's easy to do, but when you take offense of that and try to get him to get it, you're treating your snapping turtle like a toy poodle. And it's getting tired of being dragged around by a dog leash. And the more you do this, the more that snapping turtle is going to get frustrated and snap back. Today I want to talk to the NT wives or husbands, as the case may be. When you go on too long with your message delivery, or when you try to tackle more than one issue at a time, your ASD spouse is going to run into brain overload. We're just going to call it data overload, because you're providing too much data too quickly. He's not able to absorb all of that. And so at some point in your message delivery, let's say, for example, it's a 20-minute discussion, or in this case, perhaps a monologue, he's going to get to the point where he's not going to be able to listen or understand or retain. So think of your ASD spouse as that old computer that you used to have that has so much software on it and so little memory space that when you turn it on and you work on it for a little while, it slows down, and at some point it freezes, and then you have to shut it down and reboot it, and then it takes forever to start up again, but then when it does, it kind of runs a little faster than it did previously. So your husband on the autism spectrum is like that slow computer, and the more data dumping you do, the more data overload he runs into, and then the rest is history, because at some point he can't even listen to you anymore, because all he can focus on is his anxiety or how he's feeling criticized. And if you continue to data dump, he's only going to be able to listen to 80% of your message. And as you continue to data dump, he's only going to be able to understand 60% of what he listens to. And as you continue to data dump, he's only going to be able to retain 40% of what he understands. And as you continue to data dump, he's only going to implement about 10% of what he retained. So of your 100% message delivery, you're only getting about a 10% return on your investment of time and energy. I hope that makes sense. So here are some examples of data dumping. When you talk too long, when you tackle more than one issue at a time, when you come at him when you're emotional or upset, either angry or crying, when you come at him with poor timing, in other words, he's not prepared, he didn't know that you were going to have the talk, he's doing something else. So you're coming at him at a very inappropriate time for him because it disrupts his routine or structure. The other component of data dumping would be when you speak in vague terms, especially when you talk about how you feel and expect him to take how you feel and apply it to some course of action he's supposed to take. Okay? Feelings, especially if you have alexithymia, are vague. So your expression of feelings is not his motivation to change. And lastly, another data dumping component would be jumping from the current issue to multiple past issues that he can't fix now. So there it is. Your data dumping downloads as data overload. Then he is going to do some version of a meltdown or a shutdown. Literally, he's going to have to shut down and reboot. ASD level 1, developmental disorder. That means that developmentally, the socially emotional part of the brain is underdeveloped relative to the logical part of the brain. That's not an insult. There's way more strengths with ASD level 1 than weaknesses. Guys in here are probably smarter than me. They're great at systematizing, great with logic, great with seeing things in pictures, great at looking at a variety of chaotic symbols and being able to make sense out of it. So the list is long and deep of the assets. So there is a bonus, ironically, that comes with ASD level 1. Bill Gates created the computer as an example. So the society benefits from having this different way of thinking. Since they're low in social and emotional intelligence compared to the other things that are going on where they're high, they are by default low in social and emotional needs. There's the problem. If I suck at riding a unicycle, and it doesn't matter how many times I practice it, I still can't get it, I'm by default not going to have any need to ride a unicycle. So the NTYs in here, opposite. High in social and emotional intelligence and needs. Next problem, since we're talking about social emotional stuff, his deficits, if we want to call it that, appear as if he is selfish, insensitive, uncaring, narcissistic. Emphasis on appears that way. She makes the false assumption that that's what's going on, and why wouldn't she? Next problem, she tries to recruit him to be more socially and emotionally connected, raises his anxiety. The method that she uses, I'm not faulting her, she's doing the best that she knew how, given the circumstances, raises his anxiety. What does he do? He seeks anxiety reduction. How does that look? He spends a lot of time with his special interests, or his work, or he isolates. What is the end result of that? It downloads into the NT mind as just more selfishness, uncaring, insensitivity, and doesn't care about the relationship. I'm not important. So there's the dilemma. Oh, and we could throw in coronavirus, political tension, racial unrest, quarantine with the person that you're not getting along with, and maybe 4 or 5 other things. And then you wonder why there's a problem? That's the bad news. The good news is social skills can be taught. He can learn to develop some emotional literacy. It's not doomsday. For the NTYs, you would love for him to be up here, right level with you in the business of emotional reciprocity. That's never going to happen. But we can sure get him from down here to somewhere in the middle ground, which could conceivably get you in the area where it's at least acceptable now. Perhaps not ideal, but it's a noble effort that is resulting in some significant improvement. So the question then becomes, okay, well, what can we do? Well, the first thing we just did is we established the fact that a lot of this behavior is not intentional, but I'm also going to validate that that doesn't really matter on one hand because unintentional hurtful behavior still hurts. So that doesn't get him off the hook. Having these traits is no license to just go around spraying on people like a skunk because you happen to be high anxiety in the moment. So he can work around his areas of challenge, and he can certainly capitalize on his strengths, which there are many. And when he has his blind spots, she can be some version of a compassionate coach that wouldn't take much time or energy to pull that off. So another common concern that comes up with NT wives about their autistic husband is she will say something along the lines of, he won't answer my questions. I'll ask him, what took you so long? He will say, I don't know. Or she'll ask, what are you planning to do with such and such? And he'll say, never mind. Or he just won't respond to her questions at all. And so what's up with this in the vast majority of cases is he knows that if he answers that question, that's just going to open the floodgates for a bunch of other questions. Or he's simply afraid to answer the question because he feels like he's going to get in trouble for the answer. So if you have asked him a question and then he answers your question, but then you follow that up with 12 other questions, he's going to download that as I'm being interrogated, this raises my anxiety. Or if you have asked a question and he gave you the answer and you didn't like it and then you had a problem with the answer and chastised him accordingly, then he's going to be gun shy about answering any of your questions. Or he is going to give you the answer that he thinks you want to hear just to get you off of his back. So one of the things that you could do in this case would be to let him know prior to asking the question that you're not going to be asking follow-up questions, or he's not going to be in trouble for the answer to the question. So you could say, I've got one question. I would like the answer to it. I promise not to follow that up with a dozen other questions, and I promise not to use your answer as an opportunity to get punitive or parental. So if he knows he's not going to be interrogated or criticized, he's going to be much more likely to answer your one question. Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendar link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.